I'm super excited to be here, and like everyone else, I'm maybe the poster child for imposter syndrome. I have all the right academic credit, undergraduate conservatory, New England Conservatory. I did my graduate work with Curtis Bond over at RPI across the border, lots of Macs there. Worked at EarCom in '98, and then again a little bit later, and then doctorate in Princeton, all of the stuff. But I've never been to ICMC, and I've never been to NIME, and I've never been to Seamus, and I'm at the Max Expo now on stage, and I'm the first person you're hearing, and I'm trying to think, what do I have to tell you? And I think maybe an improbable story wrapped in a whole bunch of potential that comes out of a happenstance introduction to Max in 1996 when I was an undergraduate. And I have this quote up here, "Problems that do not yet need solving," which is actually a complete quote, that what has no conceivable, imaginable purpose may be the solution to problems that do not yet need solving. And that comes from the wonderful Laurie Spiegel, from an incredible essay that she wrote in 1995. That was then. This is now kind of reflecting on the history of technology and the arts. And her intent was, in talking about her time at Bell Labs, to think, where she was kind of artist in residence in a similar position to what I'm doing now, to think about developing things that no one knows what they're for, quite what they're usable for yet, and then letting the things have enough expansive agency to incorporate the needs and desires of the people who end up using them. And I think it's that kind of agency that has made Max such an enduring part of our creative landscape for 3 decades now. And a lot of this, I was asked to sort of aim at some of the history stuff, and I find myself in the last 2 years in this ridiculous history vortex where I'm on the one hand in this position at Columbia University, and on the other in this improbable position at Bell Labs in the reforming of their Experiments in Art and Technology initiative. I started at Columbia after 3 years in a tenure-track joint appointed position in visual arts and music and technology at Stevens Institute, where I was running a lab called Sensory Computation, Experimental Narrative Environments, which is a fancy grant-making machine for doing VR and AR and multi-channel audio work in the context of a university. I was pulled over to Columbia as visiting faculty to teach a critical theory class in their sound art program. While I was at Stevens, I had been artist in residence at Bell Labs for about 6 months as a kind of trial balloon to see whether that kind of a structure would work. And then I became assistant director of the sound art program after about 6 months at Columbia as visiting professor. And then Bell Labs extended my artist in residency for about a year. Now I'm acting director, and I'm in the weirdly amazing position to be indefinitely at Bell Labs with an office and a studio, and sort of helping to direct creative research there at the intersection of technology and humanism and creativity. And that's insane, because these words, the Computer Music Center, Columbia University, and Nokia Bell Labs, which are sort of like rubber stamps within our universe for sort of things that have made a lasting impression. This is not the picture that I have in my head of what these places are. This is the picture that I have in my head of what these places are. That's the RCA Mark II synthesizer, which is in the office next door to mine, and that's Max Matthews at Bell Labs, whose office I walked past on the way to my office, where his office was. Interestingly, we're here in the former Sprague Electronics building. There are Sprague capacitors in the RCA Mark II synthesizer. So if we couldn't tie this in any other glorious way, we're tying it in by the fact that if we restore this thing in the next year or two, which is what I'm trying to do, we will need to recap all the Sprague capacitors. So Sprague, if you're up there, send us a miracle, some non-drained capacitors. But there's a deeper story here that relates to how I first heard about the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center and how I first heard about Max Matthews. And it actually is this, which is in my weird little New England Conservatory electronic music studio in the basement of the library at NEC. There was a full complement of Electrocomp Music Lab's analog synthesizers, which were made here in Connecticut. They were teaching synthesizers. They had giant knobs and huge faceplates, and they showed you where the patch cables were supposed to go. Oh. Sorry, Max. There were 2 studios. There was this one that was all the analog stuff with the patch cables, and there was this other one with the MIDI stuff. So Morpheus, EMU Morpheus. If you don't know that thing, the Z-plane filters are crazy. But stacks and stacks of these synthesizers, and what do you control it with? Opcode, Studio Vision Pro. And so this is MIDI controls going out to the Morpheus, and then because of where we were recording into magnetic tape. But because we had thousands of MIDI synths, Opcode also provided this device called Galaxy Patch Studio, which allowed you to keep track of all of the thousands of patches on all of these MIDI devices. Opcode, being desirous of increased business, sent a free copy of Max to New England Conservatory, which sat on a shelf. And the electronic music studio was in the basement of the conservatory library, and if you were in there after the library hours, you got locked in overnight. And so there's a cot, actually. I was not the first person to get locked in the studio overnight. And one night I was locked in there, and I was wide awake and caffeinated, and saw the Max copies there, and installed it on the SE that was in the lab. I just want to point out, enthusiastic know-nothing kid, alone with tools without forum or help. You'd better really mean it. So if you wanted to do things with the analog synthesis side of the world, if you make a cut with a razor blade in a piece of tape, it's permanent. And it matters what you do, and it takes time to think about, and you have to plan what it is that you want. And so I had spent the first 6 months of my time in the studio slaving over these cuts, and it was anachronistic, I know. I graduated in 1998 from college, so it shouldn't have learned in this method. It's wrong for me to have been taught this way. I know this now. But what it did was it tied into my sense of planning, which I'll explain in just a second. I loved Max at that time because I could send lots of, like if you wanted pitches with a reel-to-reel machine, you recorded an oscillator to the thing, and then you changed the speed to change the pitch, and then you cut more tape, and it took like 17 hours in order to get a scale, and it was hard. And then Max allowed me to like attach it to the Morpheus, and I was sending arpeggios and tons of little math things and doing it wrong even then. But it played into a sense of self that has been core to my whole artistic practice, which is this improvisation when you're there, but incredible attention played to planning and execution. I grew up in a very, very rural part of upstate New York called Post-and-Kill, New York, which is just over the border on Route 2. This is the blue dot represents my house. That's my driveway. It borders 7,000 acres of Boy Scout land. Looks like that if you make it green. Looks like that if you place North Adams near it. When you wanted to do something like skateboard, you had to drive 20 minutes, get on a bus, go 40 minutes on a bus to Albany, find pavement, and skate. If my parents wanted to cook a meal, you had to know what you wanted, go to the store, because if you forget it, you were improvising the dinner. And so something about this landscape, and something about the quiet and the peace of being where you are when you're there, but planning in order to make it happen, has sort of been core to the way that I think of everything that I do artistically, and part of what I try to imbue in my students. An environment like growing up here allows you a great deal of breadth and space to listen. Similar to the listening that one does in an analog studio, where you have to hear what you want, you have to go for it, imagine it in your head, craft it from parts that don't make sense. Requires careful planning to actually execute. You have to anticipate needs. You have to think ahead, what is this piece going to need way down the line? What's going to happen if I do this later? It's a structuring principle. And then how do you build in productive friction? How do you, if you are given these tools, if you get to the max end of this equation that I've set up, if you're given all of these tools that enable you to do everything very fast with a level of improvisatory fluidity that lets you express yourself, how do you introduce productive friction into the system that gives you a moment to reflect on how it is that you make, on what it is that you do while you create? Early electronic music studios had the productive friction built in. This is the Westdeutsche Rundfunk studio in Cologne. This is room 317 at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center before it shifted to the Computer Music Center in '89. Note the stack of 32 oscillators on the right-hand side. That mixing console had 32 switches that could allow you to switch any of those oscillators to any of the other oscillators, custom busing system. It was really complicated and wonderful. And then the patch that I was just performing for you that I've been working with for about 20 years, I realized is essentially 8 oscillators and 6 sound file players, which is room 317 in Columbia where I work. So I'll just back up to the patch just so I dread doing this, but here I am, David, I listened and I put the slide in. It's 8 oscillators. It started as something very much like this. And I've been performing with it for a long time, and I actually said to myself, because I was really frustrated when I first learned Max in the context of RPI, where there are all of these rock star Max programmers around me. Curtis Bond, Jesse Stiles, Stephen Moore, incredible people who were so good at this task. For me, I wanted to lock it in and then learn it as an instrument and never change it. And I did, for a long time, play with a patch that was not dissimilar from this, connecting MIDI controllers up to this and just moving the faders and performing along with it and trying to hear deeply what I was doing. It got easy, though. It got easier and easier the more I performed with it. It was this hard thing, and the more I performed with it, the easier and easier it got. So I started to build things into the patch that enabled me to have productive friction, that enabled me to become a non-expert of my instrument again, so that I had something to work against, repel against, because if in creative life, if you don't have something to bounce off of, it's like the vacuum of space. You just go in, sort of Newton's law, like you just go in one direction unless you've got something to repel off of, a rule system you've set up, a structuring principle, a software limitation, then you go ambly into one direction and maybe eventually in a full circle. So the patch actually, now the evolution is I can go from any frequency to any frequency over time and start that process or pause it. From any panning speed to any panning speed over time and start that process or pause it. From a amplitude modulation, rate and depth over time for both facets. And from and to any number of loudspeakers. This version is 8. I can render it in a bunch of different ways. I also have the ability to let some of the tones come up without using my hands, which means I can free myself from the MIDI controller. It moves for me, and then while I'm doing that, I'm changing feedback frequencies with a cassette deck in my mouth, right? The sound file players, I used to pick them very carefully, and I'd make these devices that are on the table that are, there's a tripartite thing in my work, which is find a sound in the real world, synthesize the sound in Max, make an object that's physical with a contact mic or a microphone that actually makes the sound of the real world thing or the synthesized thing. So it's like 3 levels of mimesis. I started to get really good at it. I'd have these ice recordings, and I'd bring a plastic bag with me, and I would crackle the plastic bag, and the ice recordings would crackle, and people would be like, "Oh, look, you're playing the field recording, and it's dynamic." So then I started to I needed more. I needed it to be more difficult. So now when the patch loads, it loads the sound files at random. And so I don't know what patches I'm going to get, and I never come with the same set of equipment twice. So now when I show up on stage, I have to figure out how to get the sounds that I know are in those field recordings out of this performable thing that's with me on stage. And this is a hugely simple, ridiculously stupid thing to do, but that productive friction has enabled me to craft the time of my performances in a way that I feel embodied, and I can draw audiences into the performance space with me through concentration rather than them seeing no labor from me and having that lack of labor turn into lack of respect, and that lack of respect, lack of attention, and lack of attention turning into zoning out, the wrong kind of zoning out. So that's room 317 now. I demoed it last summer, and we rebuilt it into a proper electronic music studio. So if you ever come back down, it's not the CMC you used to think it is. So how did I get to Bell Labs, and how does this relate? It's Bell Labs approached me because I'm engaged in haptics. And I'm engaged in haptics because I'm curious about what happens when systems that don't provide physical feedback give you physical feedback to offer some productive resistance. So this goes down into my research profile. Communication theory is the same thing. I've got a source and a receiver and a noise channel in the middle, and how do you get the message clearer? And spatial audio, I've just been fascinated since I was a kid with the spatiality of audio. So we've ended up coming back full circle, and now I'm teaching Max to people who were on the team that wrote C. My office is 2 doors down from that and 1 floor below where they invented Unix. It's imposter syndrome is like you walk in the door, it's like, here's your card. I was asked, for example, to make a haptic glove so that Stephen Fry could reach up and touch an animated butterfly and feel the butterfly land on his finger. Because that's something you do. We went out to a vegan dinner, it was nice. Just a brief overview of some of the projects we've used Max for. This is on the top left-hand corner. I fed Arthur Ashkin's favorite Schubert song through wind instruments using 3D printed loudspeakers inside of the instruments. And Max drove a little processing algorithm that reprocessed the Schubert while the instrumentalist played a score of mine when he won the Nobel Prize and was awarded and was celebrated at Bell Labs. We developed a piece with Anna Thorvaldsdottir, so International Contemporary Ensemble, and I had a residency with Bell Labs where they have an anechoic chamber you can see in the background. It's the oldest and most historical anechoic chamber in the world, 45 years, the Guinness Book of World Records for the quietest room in the world. The condenser microphone was invented in it, that kind of thing. They built a 4K short throw projector that makes a 64-channel hybrid ambisonic wavefield system. One of the walls becomes a wall onto the anechoic chamber, and you can perform in the anechoic chamber dry and then process it wet into the system, which is kind of cool. Come by, we'll show it to you, but not all at once. I built an ambisonic system to recreate the inside of the acoustics of a submarine under the Space Shuttle Challenger at the Intrepid Museum, which was insane. I had a postcard of the Challenger on my wall when I was growing up. And that's Alvin Lucier sitting quietly in the anechoic chamber, trying to think of what he'd want to do in that space and realizing that none of his music works there because there's no reflections. I've been working on 3D printed extensions of instruments, and while it doesn't seem immediately a Max thing, I couldn't do any of this stuff without the simple Max patches that drive the process. This is Morgan Evans Weiler performing a piece of mine that uses this 3D printed loudspeaker enclosure that has a speaker that fires down and a speaker that fires up. There's a little dead simple filter coefficient inside that we took a longitudinal recording of the violin, propagation up and propagation down, applied the filter coefficient to the up and down speakers. When it plays sine tones or noise, bandpass white noise through the speakers with a little algorithmic computer-aided composition thing. The sound is coming from the violin at the position of the violin while the violinist is playing with the filter coefficients that make it sound as though it's coming from a violin, propagating into the room like a violin. The Max for this is very easy, but the thing that it enables is for me a profound connection between an instrumentalist and the intimacy with which they're able to hold and hear their instrument and a sound source that wouldn't be possible without the software. I've done a lot of this stuff with 3D printed inserts for instruments. This is Rebecca Heller from International Contemporary Ensemble being judged by Vladimir Ushashevsky in our offices. This piece takes a loudspeaker, puts it into the bell joint of the instrument, plays the B flat, which is the 2.4 meter fundamental of the full instrument, and the F harmonic series, which is the fundamental of the tone that goes to the bend in the crook of the instrument at the bottom. I brute force synthesized the tone of these instruments so that I could adjust the partials and shape the change over time. And as she plays, she hears bassoon sounds coming from inside the bassoon resonating like a bassoon, but they alter a little bit. She feels the sound of the bassoon playing back at her lips, and it changes the way that she interacts with the score. We've done a bunch of projects with other people. This is Kabir Carter improvising with a piece that he developed in the anechoic chamber at Bell Labs, where he's got sound coming from both of the loudspeakers at the corners. He's got an Ambio Sennheiser ambisonic mic in his hand, and he's spatializing the audio in the 64-channel system for the audience by moving the ambisonic mic around the space. And the real-time dynamic adjustment of the spatial field is all done in Max during that process. So lastly, I thought I'd end with, when I took both of these roles, the New York Public Library heard that this had happened and that I was in touch with the people in the archives at Columbia and also the archivist at Bell Labs. They invited me to come and do a residency where I responded to the collections with ambisonic works in response to classic pieces in the electronic music literature. I started to find so much stuff that I was like, let's not make this an installation about me, let's make this an installation about our history. And so I mounted this 3-month exhibition, which was seen by a couple thousand people, and we made a one-to-one mock-up of the RCA synth so people could stand in it. We had the first public address loudspeaker, all 3 of the first microphones, the condenser, the dynamic, and the electret condenser that were all invented at Bell Labs, so that people could see with their hands. We had a Albus Terz filter, which was the filter at Cologne that Stockhausen used that was also at the CMC, with a note on it from Uszczewski that says, this instrument should be played unemotionally. But the best part, and this is the thing that relates to today for those of you who are younger in the group, there are 2 letters that we found in the archives. One of Judith Shatton, who founded the Virginia Center for Computer Music, as a junior in high school, writing to Vladimir Uszczewski and saying, can I have a summer job? And then Joseph Kubera, who is a pianist who worked with Cage and Tudor, when he was a junior in high school with his medieval music electronics band, asking if he could come to Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center and work. And so the whole thing is wrapped around this ambisonic cube that's done in Max, and we built a little kiosk so that you could see what the pieces were. We left it out of full screen mode so that people could see that Max Matthews at Bell Labs, who enabled computers to sing for the first time, has a direct legacy to the way that we create music every day as composers in the 21st century in one form or another, whether we are hip-hop or techno producers, IDM producers or sound designers, people doing theater and dance, or composers in experimental electronic music. There's a way that one can engage with Max to solve a problem that makes our lives easier. And so for that making my life easier, I'm immensely grateful to this community, and thank you very much for listening to me today.